welcome to the Book Club Review, the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking. If you're familiar with London, you might think that the only bookshops that can afford top West End rates are the big chains like Waterstones, but you'd be wrong. Tucked away in a tiny Soho courtyard is The Second Shelf, a quirky independent store selling rare books, modern first editions and rediscovered works by women. A.N. Devers, the shop's proprietor, told me about how the opportunity to rent the space came up and how she went from rare book dealing to running her own bookstore, a step that she hadn't expected to make.
I had done a Kickstarter to start a magazine about rare books by women, and it was to be a literary magazine and a rare books catalog, and to put books for sale online in an online shop. I had been a rare book dealer for about a year, and I had this idea that I would focus on rare books by women. But there was so much energy behind the Kickstarter, and there was press, and there was a lot of support that someone actually emailed me out of the blue and offered me a really good deal for a year if I wanted to open a bookstore in Soho. And I thought it was not real. I thought it was spam. I was like, this is the strangest email I've ever received. But I then blinked and took a deep breath and said, go see it. Go see what they're talking about. And I really had no idea. I had no expectation. I thought, just so it doesn't keep you up at night, that you've missed out on some great opportunity. And I came and looked at the space and I thought, you know what? I can make this work. I had a definite idea, a manifesto of what The Second Shelf is about, which is that it's a very male trade. It's about 80% male dealers selling to mostly male customers, and their primary focus is books by men. And that is, of course, not across the board, and things are changing a bit. But I had been to book fairs and just been gobsmacked by the lack of representation of women's work on the shelves and the price of the work being less than their male counterparts, and thought, well, if I were a rare book dealer, I would want to focus on books by women and work by women. And it was an idea that wouldn't let go. So here we are at my bookstore, very new, and I sell everything from collectible Penguin first printing paperbacks that are £8 all the way up to something as expensive and special as Jane Austen's best friend's copy of Sense and Sensibility, which has her friend's ownership signature in it. Her name was Martha Lloyd, and she made Jane Austen's ink.
The shop is new, but it sort of feels old. There's a wonderful kind of lived-in antique air.
I am a nester. I always have been. I really like interior decorating, at least for myself. So I treated it almost as if I was setting up my own space. And part of the reason I think it feels old maybe is I found old antiquarian end pages from books and put it on the wall as my wallpaper. So we have this beautiful marbled wallpaper, the kind of thing that you would see when you would open an old book. But we've tried to also keep it fresh. We've put in a pink floor and we have a pink kettle. And I've put as much pink in as I can everywhere because you would never find pink in a normal secondhand bookshop. So trying to also sort of be a little punk rock at the same time. But it is quite cozy in here, and most of the books I sell are old. I do sell a few new titles as we do events for really great writers, but almost everything we have is old. And I think that it's good to sort of reflect what your stock is in how your shop looks and feels.
Absolutely. I think you've nailed it. To many keen readers who are surrounded by books, the idea of valuing a book for not just the content, but it's actually the object itself might seem strange. I have to say it does seem quite strange to me. It was quite a new idea. Can you explain what is a collectible book?
A lot of women readers were the kind of readers, or at least I am, who would read a book and love it so much that we immediately give it to a friend. And that was our way of sharing and caring for that writer and that book. And that is a wonderful way. It's the reason book clubs exist. It's the reason why actually women buy and read more books than men. There is a history of book collecting that is a very masculine pursuit, almost like collecting classic cars. They want their favorite James Bond titles, and they want them to be pristine and perfect jackets and no signatures. And they work their way up to having a very just incredible set of something like that. That has developed through time, and I actually am working to sort of demystify the idea of collecting as just being that kind of thing, at least for my audience. I'm trying to get women to collect books because we are so unrepresented in the book fair world, in the rare book world. There's a site called Rare Book Hub that shows the top 500 sales of the year in rare books. For last year, of the top 500 most valuable books in rare books, only 9 were by women. Yeah. And to me, that's disturbing. That actually says something about our value and our equality in a range of fields, because women don't just write fiction. They write about everything, and they have for a long time. Women have been writing for thousands of years. How do you get people to understand this? Well, guess what else? Women are very practical. And if you tell them there's a problem to solve, and if you give them a good reason, they will understand. So what's happened is we have women now starting first edition collections, sending me their pictures to say, I'm going to collect first novels by women because I'm really interested in the first initial start of a woman's career. Or finding ways that's affordable to collect. Buying birthday gifts, buying Christmas gifts where you buy a beloved book for someone else and they have a special copy. What happens then is that book becomes cherished and put on the shelf, and that actually represents value. To have titles by women in your book collection that are carefully curated, that are loved, that you will see, that other people will see and talk about, that actually helps a woman's career, believe it or not, little by little. The more people who invest in books by women in this way, the more of a market it creates. Then the more book dealers buy those books to sell to other people, talk about them, contextualize them. It actually helps women get back in print. It helps raise the value on books. When there's a market for it, more people take notice. So if a woman is out of print, things can be brought back into print. For instance, a woman named Bridget Hughes, who's an editor of a literary magazine called The Public Space, discovered a writer who was out of print named Betty Howland. She's a big inspiration. Both of them actually are a big inspiration for me in my shop. Betty Howland died last year, but she had been forgotten, completely forgotten. She wrote 3 books. She was a MacArthur Genius in America. She had won a Guggenheim Award. And she hadn't published in a long time for a lot of reasons, but no one talked about her work, and she was totally obscured from literary history despite all of these accomplishments. Bridget Hughes republished some of her letters and then started an imprint, putting out her first novella that was unpublished in book form, as well as many stories as a new collection as her 4th book. And a lot of that happened because of the energy behind this issue where she republished her work and introduced her. And I ended up writing a piece about Betty Howland that also got read, and all of a sudden her books were worth more. So it is a literal actual marketplace that has an impact on literary history. And so even though it might be obscured from people or they might not see the import of it, I think that we can make a really good case for why it's really important.
I wanted to talk about the magazine a little bit. It's now a biannual, I think.
Yeah. I had hoped to do a quarterly when I started the business, but I didn't know I was going to open a bookshop. And right now I'm the only full-time employee, so it's hard to put out a 4-time-a-year magazine, but we're doing it biannually, and our next is forthcoming. We're actually working on final design right now and making sure all of our ducks are in a row, and hopefully it'll be out very soon. It's basically a hybrid. It's a rare books catalog, which is a very niche trade kind of thing where we sell and describe important books. However, I didn't want it to be just that. I wanted to commission women writers to write about the books that they love so that there would be this interplay between seeing a book in its first edition form, which is informative in and of itself. Some of these books, people have never seen the cover, what they originally looked like, and showing when they came out and any details that we can give about those books. And then also highlighting why they're important, why they're beloved, how they changed a person's life. So we commission essays, even fiction, poetry. We also interview who I would call bookwomen, women in the trade, booksellers. The next issue has an interview with a book conservator who's helped us restore what was becoming a very broken copy of a really important book. It's Vanessa Bell's personal copy of her sister's first novel, Virginia Woolf's first novel, The Voyage Out. So we do all sorts of things. We've commissioned a poem about Sylvia Plath's skirt in our first issue by Ariana Reines, who's one of America's most avant-garde and wonderful poets. It's called How to Wear It, in which she sort of instructs a person who might have come into possession of Sylvia Plath's skirt how and why they should wear the skirt. These kinds of things are what we're very keen on doing at the Second Shelf. It's not just a bookstore.
Laura gave it to me as a present when she first discovered the shop, and I was so thrilled when I read it because it feels like something completely new. I've never read anything quite like it. I loved your essay at the beginning where you talk a little bit about your background. You were teaching literature, and the conversation you had with a colleague where you were trying to put together a syllabus for your class, and he was quite negative, wasn't he, about women writers?
Well, he was a professor and a book critic, and I looked up to him, and I just thought, well, I was sort of just graduated with my master's in writing, and I was given this opportunity to build my own syllabus out of the blue very last minute for my first class that I would teach. And it was quite strange because it was an English literature class for undergraduates, and it was called Women in Literature. And I was like, I'm going to ask my colleague, who was an instructor at my school, although I didn't study with him, what he thinks of this. And he just was like, what do you mean women in literature? Why does there need to be women in literature? You should ask yourself why they would assign that course. And it really felt he wasn't really clear about what he was getting at, but my overall feeling about it was that he was suggesting that maybe there was no reason for that sort of course. But I deep down knew, based on my own experience as an undergraduate at a very good college, that the amount of women that I studied during that time of 4 years as an English literature major was really a very small percentage of what we were assigned for reading. And then being my own reader and as a writer, learning so many women writers who were left off syllabi, so many ones that I think are some of the best writers are not taught or in the canon or firmly cemented in the canon. And that moment might have been an awakening for me more than any other time, because I don't think I realized that I was sort of a literary feminist in the sense that I started to question what I had been taught for the first time, because his answer was dismissive.
You talk about a book that sounds really interesting, but I'd never heard of it. It's called The Mad Woman in the Attic.
Oh, yeah. It's a classic academic text by Sandra Gilbert and Susan Gubar that is like a 400-page academic work that documents the way women writers have been actually conversing with themselves through their own fiction in a conversation that hadn't been acknowledged. The Brontes are referencing works that they read. Jane Austen is referencing works that she read. And a lot of these books are by women. They're having a side conversation. You know, Virginia Woolf talks about the way that we don't even know, because we're the second sex, really. She doesn't use that phrase. That's a Simone de Beauvoir phrase. But because we've basically been subjects of the patriarchy, we don't even know what we would be writing outside of it. So this idea that the kinds of things we write are under conditions that are because of our social upbringing and culture, and because the traditional literary history doesn't necessarily acknowledge those works as great, or often doesn't, but not linking them together, not showing that there's been this conversation happening, and that really kind of doesn't include all of these works of literary genius we were taught as really superior, which are books by men. Until they wrote The Mad Woman in the Attic, there is an overlooked history of women's literature. And I think that what's sad is that that is taught as feminist criticism as opposed to just fact.
You talk about the books here in the shop. You have the nice idea of them sort of having conversation, whispering to one another. Yeah.
A really common thing that happens in the store is that women come in and realize that they go to the shelves and they were like looking for a certain book or a certain writer, and then they've never seen a whole wall of books just by women, and it's quite moving for them. We've had people tear up or gasp, you know, just like, oh, takes their breath away. And then they also say things like, well, I went to the D's and the first D that I came into my mind was Dostoevsky. We have been conditioned to expect all of these works to be hard to find on the shelf, because when you go into bookstores, it is still a majority of titles by men, especially if it's a classic bookstore highlighting classic work. I think there were some bookstore experiments where, to raise awareness of inequality on the shelves, new bookstores were flipping away all of the books by men to the back so you could only see the ones by women. And even in bookstores that were doing this to be provocative, they realized that they had 25 or 30% of titles by women on the shelf. In our store, I would say 98% of titles are by women on the shelf, and we have a few exceptions of books about women that are by men that are important, and also some girl heroine titles. We have Alice in Wonderland, but we highlight editions of Alice in Wonderland that have women illustrators, because they are also quite looked over in bookmaking. Any kind of woman. We have some books that are designed by women that are by men. What we try to do is highlight women's contribution to literature in all sorts of forms. And people really get excited. They also start remembering books they loved that they hadn't thought of in a long time. Because I think the other thing that happens, not to get too like lectury, is that even when they're famous or have had successful literary careers, by the time they're getting older, they get less press, less reviews, they get sort of dropped a bit. And this happens across all fields as well. Like the aging woman doesn't get the same treatment as the aging man. They're saying, oh, what happened to so-and-so? And oh, I really love that book. I want to read others by her. So the space acts as a place of discovery or rediscovery or re-remembering books and authors.
I absolutely had that experience you mentioned when I was here for a while looking through the shelves, and it's like it suddenly dawned on me. partly as well that you're not used to seeing books next to each other. Normally, as you say, they would be separated by various other men in the alphabet. And here you get women writers who sit next to each other on the shelf.
Yeah, I think it's this idea of women being in conversation with one another. And maybe culturally, we don't necessarily always listen to that conversation. But in this space, this is the conversation that is happening. A lot of rare bookstores feel like museums, and they feel expensive on purpose, and that can leave out a lot of people. But at my store, it was really important to me for anyone to know that there's a way to collect at any price point. Yes, you might not be able to have a 200-pound signed copy of your favorite book, but you could start your collection with a book you haven't read by that writer for 20 or 30, or you can get a Penguin paperback in first printing. There's just lots of different ways that you can approach the idea of valuing women writers and collecting their work.
If any of our listeners is feeling inspired and wants to get started, what do you think is a good way to get going?
I think thinking about a writer that you might want to collect all of their books in first edition. There's going to be your favorite writers that obviously would be really difficult and expensive. But maybe if you can't start with Virginia Woolf first editions, try out her wonderful friend and lover's work, Vita Sackville-West. She is a bit more approachable in price. Or you can start with these things called uniform editions that were made to be collected so that you could have all the same size book. There's a lot of ways you can do it. We did this thing where we built mini libraries based on a few questions. You figure out this idea of a little mini bookshelf that represents your life. If you don't want to collect one author, you could collect what would be considered a mini library of your ideal books. There's an illustrator who has done an illustration for our next issue. Her name is Jane Mount. She gets commissions to do a watercolor drawing of people's 12 favorite books. So you could do it that way. You could do paperbacks. A lot of vintage paperbacks are out of print and they're collectible. The Penguins are lovely. Well, they just come into the store, look around, and hopefully our website will be up and shoppable very soon as well. We've been working on that for quite a while. It's been hard to do all of the things at once, but it just depends on what your tastes are, really. I think collect what you love is the main thing and figure out a way to do it on your budget.
I feel like you're many things, but you're obviously also a reader as well. Are there any books that you've come across, perhaps by writers who tend to be a bit more overlooked, that might be good for a book club to pick out?
We have a joke in the store. That was a friend of mine who's on our advisory board. She's an editor in America. Her name is Lori Munchnick. And she said, how many times can Barbara Pym be rediscovered? Because it seems like every 10 years there's a Barbara Pym, like an urgent, oh my gosh, Barbara Pym is so amazing. And what my issue with that is, it's like, why isn't she just firmly known, and kept in print? She's amazing. I didn't know her until I moved to Britain as an American. I don't even think I had heard her name. For me, what's interesting as a person who studied English literature but through an American school and being American is so many British writers haven't crossed to my side of the pond. So I didn't know that much of Stevie Smith, the poet's work. She's very collectible and wonderful. Some of the early books by writers who are very modern and still writing, like A.S. Byatt, she's not overlooked, but have people read her early books before she was famous? This is the kind of stuff I think about. Elizabeth Bowen is an incredible modernist. A really popular person, not overlooked at all, but I still think doesn't have the attention she deserves, even though she's won the Nobel Prize, is Toni Morrison. People buy thousands of her new books, but there's something about the fact that when you go to book fairs, her male contemporaries who are considered geniuses, their first edition, first printing, say like a Philip Roth, are hundreds of pounds if they're signed. And a couple of her books are, but otherwise not so much. I kind of think it doesn't really matter how famous the woman, they're all overlooked.
If you want to visit in person and get some inspiration for your book collection, you'll find the second shelf tucked away in Smith's Court in the heart of Soho. And for more details and information, check their website, thesecondshelf.com. That's all for this episode. Next up is our book club show, when we'll be discussing My Sister the Serial Killer by Nigerian writer Oyinkan Braithwaite, recently longlisted for the 2019 Booker Prize, a list that judges say comprised of energetic, diverse voices, bold and lyrical, and some a little wild. It's a rare book club head-to-head this episode, as both our book clubs read it, but what did they make of it? Would we have longlisted it? Listen in to find out. If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or email thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, why not subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts? But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.